hasn't done a thing, and Clinton tried, but that was after, in the last 2 or 3 months of his term. He didn't have time, and Johnson, others didn't do. So this is I'm not worried about Romney being Republican. But in terms of these statements, that's actually quite worrying, and his connection with Netanyahu, which is to some extent an anecdote. I mean, they worked together 30 years ago, right, or 25 years ago. But ideologically, I think they're both committed to continue to colonize the Palestinians. And when you go to these circles, when you sit with these people, they know there's no solution, but they are not fazed by it. They said, okay, there's many things that have no solutions in the world, but we manage it. And the approach, what I showed you, the statement on one hand and activity on the other, the gray spacing, if you like, putting more and more people in doubt, all these are ways how to manage what I call to manage the unwanted, irremovable, okay? The unwanted people, they're irremovable, let's manage them. And this is how the right thinks. And I don't think the left has an advantage over the right in being politically savvy. They're pretty politically savvy. And I think Romney probably will do that. Has no interest. In fact, he probably benefits from the conflict. Empire like the United States, even though it's a declining empire, it's still hugely powerful, and it will benefit from conflict. So let's be really Machiavellian about it and think. Now, Obama is a mystery, because his rhetoric and his hopes that he raised before the 2008 election, a lot of Palestinians were sort of illusioned by it. I think people are much more clever now and more skeptical, but let's wait, perhaps he'll surprise us. I doubt it, but let's hope for it. Yeah.
Yes, please. Fareed? Yes.
I wanted to ask you about this idea of ethnocracy, which I think is very interesting. You mentioned Malaysia, Sri Lanka, several countries. You also mentioned Turkey, and of course Israel. Now, it seems to me that these countries are very different in many ways. So I'd like you to clarify a couple of things. If you talk about expansion of ethnic expansion. Now, if I think of a country like Malaysia, the disadvantaged group is actually economically dominant, right? Which is not the case of Israel. Palestinians are not economically dominant, so that's a very different case. When I think of Turkey, it seems to me it's based more on restricting the expansion of minority groups rather than the dominant ethnic group trying to expand. So, for example, restricting Kurdish expansion, although at the same time, Kurds are very much integrated into the state. They have, very high economic profile. They're not discriminated against in terms of position, economy, and the state, and so on. But yet, I do believe that there is a legitimate concept.
Yeah. Okay, this was a whole discussion, 2 hours yesterday. And of course, it's a more academic discussion, but nonetheless very important, because we see, as we said, through research, that the deeper the ethnocracy, the more difficult it is to resolve the conflict. There is a connection. I think in that respect, Malaysia, Cyprus, Northern Ireland, Sri Lanka, Israel, to some extent Lebanon too, are similar. Maybe Turkey, you're right, is a little bit different, although it was just mentioned there because. And the idea is that we base domination on segregation. Okay, this is quite important. That the dominant group actually appropriates the state apparatus, and to some extent prevents the other group from joining this elite in a variety of ways. It could be by controlling the demographics through immigration. It could be by controlling the land. It could be by controlling the economy. And of course, we're talking about political engineering. So there's other factors. There are cultures. There are economies, like you rightly say, in the Chinese in Malaysia are more dominant. But since the beginning of the Malaysian ethnocratic state, through the state apparatus, and through the Bumiputra idea, the Malays have climbed up, have closed the gaps, right? So the state, it has a starting position, and then it tries to affect the transformation. In Israel, as you saw, they were quite equal in the 1940s. In fact, some people say that the Arabs, the Palestinians in the 40s were richer than the Jews. And you see how through the ethnocratic mechanisms of land development, allocation of resources and politics, the gaps open. So the state is an instrument. Now you can have harsh colonial ethnocracies. I mean, I've written quite a lot about it, and you can have more open, and it's not a black and white situation. It actually has, there's no clear line between democracy and ethnocracy, but it's a matter of emphasis. So for example, in Cyprus, where you had actually a fairly good system constructed of coexistence between the Turks and the Greeks wanted to expand the domination, and they were not satisfied, even though it was, even after the 1960 constitution, quite a Greek state, right? They had a majority, 80%, etc. But the constitution offered some protection and some affirmative action, we would call it today, for the Turks. And they, because of this expansion, they overextended and the state collapsed, right? It's partitioned, the Turks invaded, etc. And so this is one scenario. Now, enlightened elites, ethnocratic elites, like the Malay one, they learn from history. They're not going to overextend it. I think to some extent we see, in Estonia it was very, very good, real oppression of the Russians after the Soviet breakdown and gradually empowerment of the Russian minority, up to a point that it will never challenge the Estonian nature of the state. Okay? So in that respect, we see quite a lot of similarities. We keep the segregation, we keep the domination, but we try not to fall where the Cypriots fell. We try to manage the state together, if you like, keep people as maybe second-class citizens, but definitely as still citizens. So Israel in the Green Line perhaps could work like this, right? It's just that the added colonial, the weight of the colonial oppression of the Palestinians in the territory, and the way the Jews actually have integrated the territories with the Jewish residents, not with the Palestinians. The Palestinians are prevented from moving. But the Jews actually created one space that is a now much more profound ethnocracy than it was before. And I very much hope that the Malays will not go that way. And I think that kind of knowledge is very, very important. People are reading it. And to some extent, we have dynamics and leaders that are trying to cash on the rivalry, which is a real danger in ethnocracies. What happened in Cyprus, for example, was a dialectic of the Greek and the Turk leaders. And Israel is in danger of that now, because it's so tempting as part of the electoral process to mobilize against the other side. What I showed you about Lieberman is about 3 or 4 parties like this. They compete between them, right? We call it ethnic spiraling in the literature. Like they compete between them about who is inciting more against the other group. And that's profitable for them in the ballot box, right? That's the danger. So they compete against one another. And what happens now in my university, for example, that the Minister of Education, who is Likud, which supposedly is center-right or more moderate right, has trying to compete with the extreme right by trying to close a department of politics that is considered to be a progressive. And he keeps coming to the media with a view to the voters. He's not interested in academia so much. He's a Minister of Education, but with a view to the voters that we prevent this anti-Israel, radicals, etc., to be in our universities. And that, in a way, is this ethnic competition that is so typical to ethnocracies, right? And how we move from that, from this polarization to more democratic, more moderation, of course, it's a whole, like Professor Hudson said, I touched about it for 10 minutes, but I have many other ideas. And it can be done, and it has been done. But one important point here, and I think it's for Malaysia, definitely for Northern Ireland, for Estonia, is the international involvement. This is where Singapore is important. The international involvement is so important in trying to get out of the deadlock. Because sometimes it's like, you know, it's like a bad marriage. It will never be resolved unless there is a third person, right? Talking to the two warring husband and wife. So the duality is very, very difficult. And where we saw that really 400-year conflict, or 300-year conflict in Northern Ireland was resolved, and suddenly they open up the field to the Republic of Ireland, to Britain, and to the European Union. And the same with Estonia. I followed that all the time, and there was hardline ethnocracy against the Russians that were left there. They considered them settlers. They wanted them to leave, and they're already fourth generation that said, this is our homeland. We cannot leave. And they didn't give them citizenship. And gradually now, with the European Union involvement and with their accession to the European Union, It's not equal yet, but there is definitely improvement, and about half the Russians now have citizenship. So this is, I think, is a lesson for Israel-Palestine that there should be an envelope, an umbrella of international involvement that will have a carrot and a stick, as you know, and it could bring us to accommodate one another.
Could I follow up on that?
Yeah.
Two remarks. First of all, as you yourself indicated, it's a little bit ironical that what you're coming out with, in a sense, is going back to the binational alternative as opposed to the partition alternative. And this is a dynamic that has played out back and forth ever since certainly since the British Mandate. And there are any number of royal commissions that went this way or that way. And finally, we're going this way again. But surely the bulk of what you presented to us indicates how difficult it is now that you have what I think in your terms would be an ethnocracy on steroids, still, for the foreseeable future, content or satisfied with essentially the way things are. There was a head of the settler movement who wrote an op-ed the other day in the New York Times basically saying, what's the problem? It's over.
Diane, right?
Yeah, that's one thing. The other point is that there is a theory in political science that might offer a way to democratize an ethnocracy, and that, of course, is the theory of consociational democracy that Aaron Leipart and others elaborated over a period of time. The key there, if I remember this correctly, though, is that elites representing different ethnicities and essentially being able to control them or manage them get together and do sort of the rational thing.
Bargaining, yeah.
And it seems to me that something like that, I'm not sure that's the answer because it sure doesn't look like it fits in a situation where elites don't actually seem to be managing things in a neat and tidy way. But it seems to me that there's a gap between the reality that you presented and the trends you presented on the one hand, and those really intriguing diagrams that you presented at the other end with a joint council and this and that, and it's
how to get from one to the
exactly.
other. Yeah.
So I
yeah.
wondered if you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Well, of course, I've dealt a lot with consociational and written a lot about consociational theory, and I'm in that mold, but with some caveats and provisions, because consociational democracy tends to buttress or even deepen the structural differences between groups, because they have to organize politically and within. So I prefer what is in the literature multiculturalism, which is a little bit more open-ended, where groups can actually organize, but there is exit options for them, etc., etc. But with the proviso also that it's the two different multicultural societies in Israel and Palestine. It's quite important. It's not a binational state. It's a confederation, right? And this, in a way, will create a Palestinian space that will have Jews in it. Will have a Jewish space, will have Palestinians in it, and that will have to make the negotiation. And other groups, too. Other groups are very important. The ultra-Orthodox in Israel are probably inside Israel as important as a Palestinian, as a structural force that changes the regime. There's close to 1 million people. They're very politically organized. They're very united. They have an agenda to make the state more and more of a theocracy. So I think it's enough that those kind of issues will be dealt by the two sovereign